Think your winter is brutal. While you're curled up with hot chocolate and the thermostat humming at 72 degrees Fahrenheit, Viking peasants braced for a Scandinavian deep freeze armed with nothing but wool, firewood, and sheer survival instinct. Every autumn was a race against death. One mistake in their preparations meant starvation, frostbite, or worse. No second chances, no safety nets, just months of brutal labor, communal survival, and wisdom forged through generations of hardship. Compared to their world, scraping ice off your windshield is child's play. So how did they outlast the deadliest season with nothing but grit and ancient know-how? The first thing that struck Viking peasants wasn't the cold, it was the darkness. In central Scandinavia, winter days shrank to a mere 4 to 6 hours of pale, watery sunlight. Imagine spending 18 to 20 hours in near total darkness, where every task, from feeding livestock to collecting firewood, had to be accomplished in a narrow window of twilight. For context, that's like trying to complete all your daily activities during an extended lunch break. But the darkness was just the opening act. Winter temperatures in Viking Age Scandinavia regularly plunged to -20 degrees Fahrenheit or -29 degrees Celsius, with coastal regions facing the added bite of wind chill and maritime storms. To put this in perspective, that's cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under 30 minutes, about the same temperature as the inside of your home freezer. Modern weather stations in these regions still record similar temperatures, but we face them with Gore-Tex and central heating, not homespun wool and wooden walls. The winter presented 3 lethal challenges that every Viking household had to overcome. First was the cold itself, an invisible predator that could kill through hypothermia or frostbite. Without reliable shelter and heating, death could come in a single night of exposure. Second was starvation. Unlike our modern world of 24/7 supermarkets, Vikings faced months where growing food was impossible. Their autumn preparations needed to be perfect, or spring would find their households decimated by hunger. Third was isolation. Winter storms could cut off Viking communities for weeks at a time. A family that ran out of food or fuel couldn't simply trek to the nearest village for supplies. Attempting such a journey in a blizzard was often a death sentence. For Viking peasants, surviving winter wasn't just about enduring the cold, it was about preparing for a siege by nature itself. Every autumn became a race against time to gather enough resources to survive nature's harshest season. Their solutions to these challenges weren't just clever, they were essential blueprints for survival that would be passed down through generations. If you've ever had your power go out and worried about the food in your freezer, you've had a tiny taste of what Viking peasants faced every year. But while we panic about a few days of food storage, they had to preserve enough food to feed entire families and their livestock for up to 6 months. Their solutions weren't just effective, they were ingenious combinations of chemistry and careful timing that we still use today. The preservation process began long before the first frost. By late summer, Viking households launched into a carefully choreographed dance of food preservation that would make modern preppers look like amateurs. Every edible item had its own preservation method, perfected through generations of trial and error. Meat preservation was perhaps their most sophisticated achievement. Without refrigeration, Vikings developed a multi-layered approach that would seem almost alchemical to modern eyes. Fish and meat were first dried in the cold autumn air, then smoked using specific types of wood. A typical Viking household would smoke enough meat to fill a modern walk-in closet, roughly 600 to 800 pounds or 270 to 360 kilos for a family of 6. The smoking process wasn't just about preservation, it created a protective outer layer that sealed in nutrients while keeping out bacteria. But their most fascinating preservation method was fermentation. Take skyr for instance, a dairy product that's currently trending in high-end grocery stores, but was a Viking survival staple. By carefully controlling bacterial fermentation, they created a protein-rich food that could last months without refrigeration. Modern food scientists have found that traditional skyr contains beneficial probiotics that actually strengthen the immune system, something those Viking peasants seemed to know intuitively. The real masterpiece of Viking food preservation was their root cellar system. These weren't just holes in the ground, they were sophisticated temperature control devices that maintained a steady 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 to 4 degrees Celsius, nearly identical to your modern refrigerator. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and rutabagas were layered between sand and straw in these cellars, creating a natural crisper drawer that could keep vegetables fresh for months. A typical Viking root cellar could store enough vegetables to provide 2,000 to 2,500 calories per person per day throughout the winter. Grains posed another challenge entirely. Vikings learned that properly dried grain could last through winter without spoiling, but the drying process had to be perfect. Too much moisture meant mold, too little meant the grain would be too hard to process. They built specialized drying racks that allowed them to control this process with remarkable precision, creating stores of grain that could last not just through winter, but sometimes for several years. Their version of a long-term emergency fund. The preservation process wasn't just about keeping food from spoiling, it was about maintaining enough nutritional diversity to keep people healthy through the dark months. Every preserved food item was part of a carefully planned nutritional strategy that provided proteins, carbohydrates, and enough vitamins to diseases. Modern nutritionists have found that this preserved food diet, while monotonous by our standards, was surprisingly well balanced. Think of your home as a machine for keeping warm, and you'll begin to understand how Vikings approached shelter design. The longhouse wasn't just a building, it was a sophisticated environmental control system that would make modern sustainable architects nod in appreciation. These structures, typically measuring 50 to 80 feet or 15 to 24 meters in length, were masterpieces of thermal engineering disguised as simple wooden halls. The first surprise about longhouses was their roommates. If you think sharing a house with pets is intimate, Viking families lived with their entire livestock collection. Before you wrinkle your nose, consider the brilliance of this arrangement. A single cow produces roughly the same heat as a small modern space heater, about 1,000 BTUs per hour. A typical Viking longhouse might house 4 to 6 cows, several sheep, and other animals, essentially creating a living heating system that required no fuel beyond the feed they already needed to provide. The building's design maximized this heat capture through a principle modern architects call passive solar design. The long axis of the house typically ran east to west, with the main door facing south. This orientation allowed the low winter sun to penetrate deep into the building, while the steep pitched roof minimized heat loss. The roof design wasn't just about shedding snow. It created a thermal envelope that trapped rising warm air and radiated it back downward. But the real genius was in the walls. Vikings developed a sophisticated insulation system that would look familiar to modern green builders. The outer walls were typically built with a technique called skifsberg, thick wooden planks fitted between vertical posts. Between these walls, they packed a dense layer of insulating material, moss, straw, and even sheep's wool. Modern testing of reconstructed walls shows they achieved an insulation value comparable to a modern home's fiberglass-filled walls. The central hearth was the heart of this indoor ecosystem. Unlike modern fireplaces that send most of their heat up the chimney, Viking hearths were designed for maximum heat retention. The smoke hole in the roof was carefully sized to maintain what we now call the stack effect, creating just enough draft to clear smoke while minimizing heat loss. The stone-lined hearth itself acted as a thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and radiating it back at night, much like modern solar heat storage systems. The floor plan followed what we'd now call zoned heating. The central area around the hearth was the main living space, while storage areas were positioned at the cooler ends of the building. Sleeping platforms were typically raised and built along the walls, keeping people above the coldest air that settled at floor level. Perhaps most ingeniously, Vikings created what we might call the first airlock entries. Many longhouses had a small antechamber at the entrance, creating a buffer zone that prevented heat loss every time someone entered or left. This feature, which we now see in modern cold climate architecture, helped maintain the delicate thermal balance they worked so hard to achieve. Before Gore-Tex and synthetic fleece, Vikings had perfected a clothing system so effective that modern Arctic explorers still follow many of its principles. Their approach to cold weather clothing wasn't just about piling on layers. It was a sophisticated system that managed moisture, regulated temperature, and protected against wind while allowing enough mobility to work. The foundation of Viking cold weather wear was wool, but not the itchy sweater your grandmother knitted. Viking wool processing was a year-round task that produced a textile with properties that modern synthetics still struggle to match. Their sheep, smaller and hardier than modern breeds, produced two distinct types of wool. A soft, insulating undercoat and longer, water-resistant outer fibers. Through careful processing, Viking textile workers could create fabrics that combine the benefits of both. Imagine a natural version of modern two-layer ski gear. The Viking layering system would look familiar to any modern mountaineer. The base layer, or undertunics, were made from finely woven wool that wicks moisture away from the skin. Unlike modern polyester base layers that can get smelly, wool naturally resists bacterial growth. Tests on reconstructed Viking wool garments show they could absorb up to 30% of their weight in moisture without feeling wet, roughly twice what modern synthetic base layers can handle. The middle layer consisted of thicker wool garments, often including the iconic Viking wool tunic. These were designed with a loose weave that created thousands of tiny air pockets, the same principle used in modern fleece jackets. A typical middle layer tunic could trap enough air to provide insulation equivalent to a modern 200-weight fleece. The outer layer was where Viking ingenuity really shone. They created water-resistant cloaks using a technique called vadmel, a heavily folded wool that was almost felt like in density. These cloaks, often treated with animal fats for additional waterproofing, could shed snow and light rain while still allowing body moisture to escape. Modern tests show these cloaks perform similarly to mid-range modern shell jackets in terms of water resistance. As for their winter boots, they came with a clever trick. Removable wool insoles. Dry them by the fire overnight and you'd wake up to warm feet ready for another brutal day. Their leg bindings. Strips of wool wrapped snug around the lower legs, adjustable for warmth and mobility, centuries ahead of modern gaiters. The most surprising aspect of Viking cold weather gear was its sophistication in handling the greatest challenge of winter clothing, managing moisture. Modern winter athletes know that sweat can be deadlier than cold. Once moisture freezes in your clothing, you're wearing an ice vest. Vikings solved this through careful garment design that included ventilation options. Their tunics often had front slits that could be opened during heavy work and closed for warmth during rest periods. The medieval equivalent of modern pit zips. The harsh reality was that no single household, no matter how well prepared, could guarantee their winter survival alone. The Vikings' greatest innovation wasn't in their tools or techniques. It was in their sophisticated social networks that turned individual vulnerability into collective resilience. The foundation of Viking winter survival was the Grand Lac, neighborhood groups that functioned like ancient mutual aid societies. These weren't just informal arrangements, they were binding social contracts. Each household in a Grand Lac had specific responsibilities and rights. Think of it as a medieval insurance policy where the premium was paid in labor and resources rather than money. Winter preparation began as a community effort long before the first frost. The Vikings had a system called dugnad, communal work days, where entire communities would gather to help each other prepare. Imagine your whole neighborhood showing up to help you stock your winter supplies, repair your roof, and ensure your heating system was ready. These weren't just helpful gestures, they were crucial survival strategies. A single household might take weeks to process their winter food stores, but a community working together could complete the task in days. The Vikings developed sophisticated food sharing systems that would impress modern economists. Each community maintained communal storage houses called byrs, where surplus food was stored. These weren't just warehouses, they were carefully managed resources that could be drawn upon if a family's supplies ran low. The system wasn't charity, it was a complex web of obligations and rights that ensured everyone's survival. Despite the brutal conditions, entertainment was essential, a survival tactic often overlooked by historians. Long winter nights weren't just endured, they were filled with veterinator, gatherings that went far beyond mere celebration. These weren't just parties, they were lifelines. A time to share news, reinforce social bonds, and battle the crushing isolation of winter. Around the fire, stories were passed down, crucial skills were taught, and the wisdom of generations ensured that survival wasn't just physical, but psychological too. The community also maintained winter roads, packed snow paths between settlements that were literally kept open by a collective effort. Each household was responsible for maintaining their section of these paths, creating a transportation network that could mean the difference between life and death during emergencies. Most remarkably, these community systems were self-regulating. Social pressure and the harsh reality of winter created a culture where cooperation wasn't just encouraged, it was essential for survival. Households that failed to contribute to community efforts found themselves subtly excluded from social gatherings and support networks, creating a powerful incentive for participation. The Vikings didn't just survive winter, they mastered it. Their resilience wasn't just about tools, but about community, turning survival into an art form. In an age of climate challenges, their legacy reminds us true strength comes from working together. Maybe it's time we learn from them.